Even today, decades after the end of that terrible war, the name Ravensbrück is spoken with a particular heaviness in the silence of a peaceful Europe. It is a name that seems hewn into the cold stone of human sorrow, yet over time, it has been partially obscured by the shadows of more famous tragedies. This place was never a field of open battle, nor was it a city held under siege by enemy armies. It was a territory created with a far more sinister purpose, designed for the methodical destruction of the very essence of humanity. Among the multitude of people whose fates intersected in these corridors entangled in barbed wire, one figure stood out distinctively. It was impossible not to notice the icy cruelty that radiated from her every movement and glance. This woman's name was Dorothea Binz, and she was that young individual who managed to turn iron discipline into an instrument of terror and her acquired power into a lethal weapon. In the final years of World War II, while the whole world burned in the fires of Hitler's mad ambitions, Dorothea's name was whispered as if it were some ancient curse. It was repeated with fear by tens of thousands of women who found themselves prisoners of the only major Nazi concentration camp created specifically for women. She was not a simple functionary or a small cog in this giant machine of death. She became the living embodiment of this system. Dorothea came into the world in 1920 in a completely ordinary German family. They were not rich, had no influence, and possessed absolutely no useful connections. Yet, in some unfathomable way, the waves of Nazi ideology swept up this girl and transformed her into one of the most terrifying figures in the entire camp system of the Third Reich. When Germany collapsed in 1945 under the weight of its own crimes, the ruins of war exposed not only cities destroyed by bombings, but also completely crippled human souls. Among the countless number of petty Nazi tyrants who tried to escape impending justice, the story of Dorothea Binz found its finale on the gallows. But to truly grasp how such a thing could happen, we must return to the source. We must look at the Germany that raised her, the war that hardened her character, and the monstrous system that managed to turn the most ordinary people into conduits of pure evil. For it is important to understand that Dorothea Binz was not born a monster. She became one in the process of her life. Germany in the 1920s was a nation literally suffocating from hopelessness. It was a defeated and humiliated country, buried under an unbearable burden of war reparations. The entire country was feverishly looking for those to blame for their troubles and for a strong leader whom they could follow without hesitation. Dorothea Binz's childhood years passed quietly and unnoticed. She grew up in the town of Fürstenberg, near Neustrelitz in northeastern Germany. Her father worked a very ordinary job. The family lived very modestly, trying to stay away from great power and loud politics. Nothing in her early biography foreshadowed who she would become in the future. But even this peaceful provincial town could not remain on the sidelines of the processes occurring throughout Germany. Inflation in the country grew at a frightening speed, hunger spread everywhere, and the air was saturated with the bitterness of defeat and resentment. The fragile Weimar Republic floundered helplessly in political chaos. Weak governments replaced one another, unable to change the situation. People desperately craved firm order. They wanted strict discipline, clear direction, and confidence in tomorrow. And it was at this very moment that Adolf Hitler appeared on the political arena. In 1933, when Dorothea turned just 13, the shadow of Nazi ideology covered literally every corner of German life. Schools, newspapers, and even children's organizations instantly turned into powerful tools for the ideological indoctrination of the population. German youth were taught that unconditional obedience was the highest virtue, that racial purity was sacred, and that loyalty to the Führer must stand above all else. Teenage girls, like young Dorothea, were actively involved in various groups, such as the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel. There, they were taught not to think about personal victories or achievements, but to serve the system and fully conform to it. In this specific environment, any individuality was erased, and the state became the new and primary family. As she matured, the rhythms of propaganda definitively formed her inner world. Posters glorifying sacrifice in the name of the nation hung everywhere. Radio broadcasts praising Hitler's genius played constantly. Teachers endlessly repeated the same thought, that there is no place for weak people in the new Great Germany. In 1939, the year of the invasion of Poland and the start of World War II, Dorothea turned 19. She was already old enough to start working. And at the same time, she was young enough that the ideology surrounding her since childhood had managed to completely shape her consciousness. That same year, she applied for a position at Ravensbrück, a recently built concentration camp located about 50 miles north of Berlin. Unlike such famous camps as Auschwitz or Dachau, Ravensbrück had its own special and unique purpose. This camp was built exclusively for women. Political prisoners, Jewish women, Romani women, members of the resistance movement, and anyone the Nazi regime considered a threat to its existence were brought here. Between 1939 and 1945, more than 130,000 women passed through the gates of this camp. Initially, Dorothea was just an employee, one of many staff members working in the SS administrative structure. But something inside her began to change rapidly. The camp, which was created for the systematic deprivation of women's dignity and identity, became the ideal stage for her personal transformation. She began her path as an obedient assistant, quiet, diligent, and extremely precise in her actions. However, within just a few months, her behavior hardened noticeably. She learned to scream at prisoners, give harsh orders, and punish. The sensation of power began to thrill her blood. The realization of her own strength instilled in her a sense of total invulnerability. In a system built on dehumanization, Dorothea Binz learned frighteningly fast. She turned out to be exactly the person the SS needed: young, disciplined, and unwaveringly covering the cause. In 1943, just 4 years after beginning her service, she occupied one of the highest positions in the camp, becoming the Deputy Chief Wardress, Oberhofscharen, of Ravensbrück, the second highest figure after the commandant himself. And from that moment, fear in the camp had a new face. Ravensbrück was unlike any other place on earth. It was a closed world surrounded by barbed wire and a ringing silence. A world where a person's identity vanished the very moment a woman crossed the camp's threshold. Here, past life had no meaning. Only strict rules existed. Only unconditional obedience. Only all-consuming fear. When Dorothea Binz first arrived here in 1939, she was merely one of the trained overseers. But even among them, she stood out. She executed every order with perfect precision, discipline, and complete lack of emotion. But it wasn't her obedience that was frightening, but the pleasure she derived from the process. It turned out she simply reveled in control. In 1943, having achieved promotion to the rank of Deputy Chief Wardress, Dorothea commanded thousands of women. A single word from her could decide who would live another day and who would never see the sunrise again. Every morning, prisoners were lined up for roll call in any weather, regardless of how weak or sick they were. Some women stood for hours, shivering from the cold in a semi-conscious state. And it was at this moment that Dorothea would appear, walking slowly along the rows, scanning the faces of the prisoners like a hunter seeking prey in the forest. If any of the women looked too fragile, if a woman accidentally coughed, flinched, or didn't stand straight enough, Dorothea would take a step forward. She understood the psychology of victim behavior. She used her power not as a frantic duty, but as a way to dominate other beings. Survivors later recalled that sometimes she didn't even need a real reason. She simply pointed a finger at someone, and this gesture was enough to finally decide the woman's fate. In Ravensbrück, violence was not accidental. It was systemic, but under Dorothea's personal supervision, it became something personal. Witnesses recalled her laughter, which often rang out during punishments. She often forced other prisoners to participate in the torture, to clean up after her, to hold the victim down, becoming involuntary accomplices in pure torment. The cruelty of the camp was not only physical, it was deeply psychological, calculated to completely destroy solidarity among the prisoners and kill any hope. One survivor from the Polish resistance recalled how Dorothea ordered her to be brutally beaten as a lesson to another prisoner. That woman fell, broken, and never recovered from what she had seen. These moments became an integral part of the daily rhythm of life in Ravensbrück. Cruelty became routine, and terror turned into official policy. Dorothea's presence poisoned everything around her. She turned the roll call square into a place of misery, and the barracks into a prison within a prison. Even the male SS guards feared her cold efficiency. And yet, amidst this horror, Dorothea found herself a companion, Edmund Browning, an SS officer who was equally obsessed with power. They walked the camp together as if it were their personal kingdom. Later, witnesses recounted that they gave orders to women while standing side by side. Sometimes they laughed together while others screamed in pain. Their relationship was not love. It was a force that fed on the suffering of others. In 1944, her reputation spread far beyond Ravensbrück. Her name was well known in other camps too. She was no longer just another guard. She had become a symbol of female cruelty throughout the Nazi system, a living embodiment of how an inhumane ideology can change a person beyond recognition. But the tide of war inexorably turned against Germany. The mechanism of death began to malfunction. Allied bombers raged in the skies over Germany, destroying infrastructure. The Red Army was advancing uncontrollably from the east. But even in this final chaos, Dorothea did not stop for a minute. While other Nazis tried to hide or flee, she continued to fanatically maintain discipline, punishing prisoners with the same cold smile, as if the Reich were destined to exist forever. By April 1945, when Soviet troops came very close, Ravensbrück plunged into total madness. Prisoners were dying en masse from hunger and disease. The guards fled in panic, trucks hurriedly burned documents, and the crematoria worked without stopping, trying to hide the traces of crimes. And despite all this, Dorothea continued to walk, making her rounds with her unchanging whip in hand, with a stone expression on her face. On April 30th, 1945, the Red Army liberated Ravensbrück. The soldiers discovered mountains of bodies lying in silence and barely living survivors with empty eyes from years of horror. But Dorothea was no longer in the camp. She had dissolved into the general chaos, removed her SS uniform, and disappeared into the stream of refugees. She thought one could simply hide. She thought history would forget her name and her deeds. But the world had seen her face, and the surviving prisoners had no intention of staying silent. When Soviet soldiers entered Ravensbrück on April 30th, 1945, they stepped onto the territory of a silent cemetery. Over 130,000 women had passed through these gates. Tens of thousands never walked back out. The air still held the sickly sweet smell of smoke from the crematorium. It was the SS' last attempt to erase the memory of what they had done. But there is a truth that cannot be burned in fire. The survivors remembered everything. Every shouted order, every humiliation, every name was whispered in fear and hatred. And among these names, one was repeated again and again: Dorothea Binz. Her cruelty was not an accidental excess. It was a precise reflection of an entire system. A system that demanded blind obedience instead of morality. The Nazi regime didn't just teach violence. It made it the norm of life. This regime told ordinary men and women that cruelty was their sacred duty, that compassion was a sign of weakness, and mercy was a betrayal of the nation. Dorothea was not born with power. She was created by this power. Every lesson in the League of German Girls, every fiery speech about racial purity, every poster calling for loyalty, all of this led her to the thought that violence is justice and total submission is strength. Thus, Ravensbrück was not just a prison for innocent people, it was also a mirror for the guilty. It was a place where ideology completely replaced conscience, where even a young woman from a quiet German town could become a ruthless instrument of unimaginable pain. When the Nazi regime fell, chaos consumed the remnants of the Reich. Nazi officials fled using fake names and documents. Soldiers feverishly burned archives. The civilian population tried to survive under the debris of destroyed cities that were once full of pride and propaganda. But no matter how far the criminals ran, the truth relentlessly followed them. In the end, justice found Dorothea too. She was captured by British troops in northern Germany. This happened after surviving prisoners from Ravensbrück described her appearance in minute detail. Her attempt to disappear among the refugees failed. The very same high precision and attentiveness she once used to control others were now used against her. She found herself in a courtroom built not by the laws of ideology, but by the laws of justice. The Ravensbrück trials, held in Hamburg in 1946, were not as widely known as the main Nuremberg tribunal. But for the surviving women, they were far more important and personal. For the first time, the whole world listened and truly heard the stories of those who had been forced to remain silent for years. One after another, survivors took the stand to give testimony. Their voices trembled with emotion, their bodies were fragile and exhausted, but their words carried the weight of thousands of lost souls. They spoke of endless roll calls under the icy sky, of cruel punishments for the slightest show of kindness, of the laughter that accompanied acts of cruelty. And with each new testimony, the image of Dorothea became clearer. Before the court stood not a faceless soldier, not a nameless bureaucrat, but a specific person who consciously decided to break other people's lives rather than save them. In that moment, the courtroom was not just a place for the administration of justice. It was a collision with human conscience. Germany had fallen, but now it faced the hardest task, to look at itself in the mirror of truth. Dorothea sat silently throughout the process. She showed no remorse, no emotion, no regret for what she had done. Until the very end, she seemed to sincerely believe that all her actions were part of some necessary order. She believed that cruelty approved by state policy could not be a mistake. But history had changed. The 1,000-year Reich had vanished, and the new world demanded an accounting for every crime. For every order shouted on the parade ground in Ravensbrück, for every woman broken by her hand, justice finally had to speak its weighty word. The trial of Dorothea Binz became one of the defining moments of the entire Ravensbrück process. Of the 29 defendants, among whom were 16 women and 13 men, she was one of the youngest. However, the crimes imputed to her were among the gravest. A deathly silence reigned in the Hamburg courtroom when the survivors began to speak. On many of them, scars were still visible not only on their bodies but in their extinguished gazes. They looked straight into the face of the woman who once held undivided power over their lives and deaths. One Polish survivor recalled the dreadful sound of a boot hitting the frozen ground at the moment Dorothea appeared for morning roll call, pointing at prisoners without any reason. Another witness, barely holding back tears, described how Dorothea continued to methodically beat a fallen woman long after she had stopped moving or showing signs of life. Their words were not dictated by a thirst for vengeance. These were acts of sacred remembrance. Every testimony tore away the last shreds of denial and lies. There was no longer a faceless bureaucracy to hide behind. There was no saving phrase that she was only following orders to absolve herself of personal responsibility. Dorothea Binz took her power consciously and used it with desire. And now the world demanded an answer from her. She never confessed to what she had done. She did not beg the court for mercy. She sat through the entire judicial process with a cold and indifferent face, as if the fate of other people, or even her own life, did not matter much to her. But history was no longer under her control. On February 3, 1947, the British military court sentenced her to death by hanging. She was only 26 years old, exactly the same age as many of the women she had destroyed. The man appointed to carry out the sentence was Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most experienced executioner, the very man who sent many Nazi officials to their deaths in Hamelin prison. May 2, 1947, became the last day of her life. Dorothea Binz was silently led out of the death cell. There were no tears, no farewell words, no last pleas for salvation. In a few seconds, it was all over. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave without ceremony, without memory, without any mention of the location. The British ensured that her name would never be honored and that her grave would not become a place of worship. And yet, history cannot be erased so simply. Decades later, when survivors began to openly share their memories, Dorothea's name surfaced again. It appeared in witness testimonies, in books, and in documentaries. She became a symbol, not a symbol of power, but a symbol of how a cannibalistic ideology can corrupt and destroy an ordinary person. How blind obedience can spawn absolute evil. The legacy of Ravensbrück went far beyond its barbed wire. It became an integral part of the overall picture of Nazi war crimes, an eternal reminder that the Holocaust was carried out not only by generals or high officials in ministerial offices, but also by women who sincerely believed that inflicting suffering served something greater than themselves. By the end of the war, the statistics of history's tragic events had become too massive for human comprehension. 6 million Jews killed, millions enslaved or displaced, entire nations covered in open scars. Ravensbrück alone took more than 50,000 lives. These were women from all corners of Europe. Justice came slowly and, unfortunately, far from all criminals. Many petty tyrants disappeared, dissolved into the ashes of post-war Germany, starting new lives. But for Dorothea Binz, justice was swift and absolute. Her life ended just as brutally as the system she served so devotedly. And yet, her story continues to echo through the years. Not as a tale of a monster, but as a formidable warning. A warning of what happens when ideology replaces human empathy, when a party flag replaces morality, and when obedience becomes the only virtue. History often remembers the men who started the war, but forgets the women who helped wage it and support the mechanism of death. The story of Dorothea Binz is a narrative not only about cruelty, it is primarily about choice. It reminds us all that evil does not always have the face of a fairy tale monster. Sometimes evil smiles, diligently follows orders, and devoutly believes it is doing the right thing. Ravensbrück was more than just a prison. It was a precise reflection of a society that traded its conscience for total control. Behind its fences, we clearly see what happens when fear replaces free thought, when ideology becomes more important than human feelings, and when all humanity is reduced to simple obedience. Dorothea Binz was 26 years old when deserved justice overtook her. Young, but already completely consumed by the darkness of cruelty, she lived a short life full of other people's suffering. Her name, which once inspired terror, now serves as an eternal symbol. A symbol of what the world must never allow again. The history of Ravensbrück belongs to every woman. To the victim who remained lying forever behind those gates, to the mothers, daughters, resistance members, and all the forgotten faces of those darkest years of Europe. Their suffering is not just a dry chronicle of the past. It is a loud warning for the future that in any case where hatred is justified by high ideology, where obedience is valued above compassion, the shadow of Ravensbrück begins to rise again. So remember their names, tell their stories to your children, and never allow the silence to return. Thank you for watching this episode from the series Files of Truth on World Evil. If you believe that history must be remembered truthfully, fearlessly, and without oblivion, please rate this material, subscribe to the channel, and follow for updates so that the voices of the victims never fade in the noise of modernity.